Chapter 11, History. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. According to Maffa's memories, this Mason fellow also came from a merchant family. His father was Monchai, the president of one of the 7 great chambers of commerce of Thousand Sails City, the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce. As a matter of fact, the status of the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce was even higher than that of the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce among the 7. After all, the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce had only risen up in the last few decades while the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce had already established itself for a millennium, and its true power was far stronger than what it showed. It was just that the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce had risen too quickly these past decades, outshining the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce to the point that almost everyone believed that the number 1 Chamber of Commerce in Thousand Sails City was the one headed by the Merlins. Coincidentally, Mason and Maffa both became magic apprentices later on while the 2 major chambers of commerce were fighting, both openly and covertly. Naturally, many busybodies started comparing the 2 of them. But that comparison stopped after a few months, because Mason managed to advance and became a mage. Afterwards, at a meeting of the 7 chambers of commerce, Mason found an excuse to ruthlessly teach a lesson to Maffa. As he had just said, he had beaten Maffa's nose into a bloody pulp. That created a large conflict between the 2 chambers of commerce. If not for Loch Merlin having an accident at sea, who knew what would have happened? This was definitely not a good memory for Maffa Merlin. It could even be considered a great humiliation. But for Lin Yun, who had witnessed the end of the world, this was really not worthy of his attention. A 9th rank magic apprentice and a 1st rank mage that relied on alchemy potions to advance. Lin Yun felt like their struggles were similar to kids playing house. Thus, Lin Yun didn't even bat an eye and only nodded, expressing his understanding before turning to leave his desk for the first bookshelf in front of him and focusing on what he had been looking for. Soon, Lin Yun found what he needed, a thick book entitled Noscent History. Lin Yun grabbed it and started slowly flipping through the pages. Lin Yun was so focused and conscientious in his studying that he didn't even notice that Mason had already come over. See, let me see that. Noscent History? No way, it's really Noscent History. Ha 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 ha. Merlin, you magic apprentices are really strange. As he said this, Mason's laughter grew even more exaggerated. How much money did your Merlin family spend to send you here? And you don't even cherish this opportunity. This is the Sage Towers Library. Even if you don't understand those books, you can still get some insights from them if you try hard enough. There is no need to put on an act and read children's books. See, Noscent History. I would feel embarrassed for you if people saw you with that cover showing. With an exaggerated double take, Mason continued, oh right, I forgot to ask, didn't the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce go bankrupt? How could your family still have money? If I were you, I would repay the debts first before spending money. I heard that a few days ago, your uncle Fario took a contract to your house to ask for money. How about I ask my father to lend you some gold for you to repay him first? At first, Lin Yun didn't pay attention to him, but Mason kept on talking. The more he talked, the more excited he became, as he had no intention of letting Lin Yun off. Lin Yun finally frowned for the 3rd time. Manager. Lin Yun's voice wasn't loud, but it echoed for a bit in this peaceful library and seemed abnormally lofty, to the point that many reading mages couldn't help glancing over, some curious, and some annoyed. As for the library manager, a 30-year-old 9th rank mage, he slowly came over from the doorway. What? As the manager made his way over, his demeanor showed that he was clearly annoyed. He had chosen to become the manager of the library because this place was quiet, so he could ponder over his work or other issues without being disturbed. But now he was being bothered by 2 kids in their 20s, so it would be strange if he was in a good mood. I would like to file a complaint against Mage Mason here. He is excessively trying to chat me up and has already affected my reading experience. So I hope that the library staff can keep him as far as possible from me. Mage Mason, is this the case? Regardless of the reason, directly disturbing others from reading was absolutely not allowed in the Sage Towers Library. Thus, the 9th rank mage looked at Mason with a severe expression. No, it's not like that. Mason was suddenly startled. He had spent a lot of his father's money to be able to enter the Sage Tower's library. It would definitely be too unfair if he was kicked out now because of a few sentences. No good. I have to find an excuse. Mason glanced at Lin Yun and suddenly thought of a plan, so he kept his voice and expression stable as he pointed at Lin Yun. I only was suspecting that he had entered the library through improper means and wanted to question him. He simply doesn't have the qualifications to stand here. He is called Mather Merlin, the son of Loch Merlin of the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce, a 9th rank magic apprentice. If I'm not wrong, only 1st rank mages are qualified to enter the Sage Tower's library. Once these words came out, not to mention the onlookers, even the 9th rank mage was taken aback for an instant before turning to Lin Yun and inquiring, "Mr. Mather Merlin, can I take a look at your pass?" Calling him Mr. and not Mage already showed that Mason's words had had some sort of effect. But that effect instantly disappeared when Lin Yun handed over his pass. The 9th rank mage casually received the pass and then froze, before an appalled expression appeared on his face. Even though he quickly covered it up, when he spoke again, everyone could hear the respect in his words. "My apologies, Mage Merlin. I'll properly take care of this matter and give you a satisfactory explanation." After saying that, he respectfully returned the pass with 2 hands as if it was a treasure. "You are kidding, the highest privilege pass, and it was issued 2 days ago. What does that mean?" 2 days ago, the 3 big shots issued such a pass in the middle of the night. If the mages of the Sage Tower were to learn that the owner of that pass was wronged by the library manager, I would be the first to suffer. "It's not necessary." Lin Yun nodded and put the pass into his pocket, picking up the book about Nocent's history once again. "Mage Mason, please follow me." On the side, the 9th rank mage's face was scarily gloomy. Although the words he used to address Mason seemed very polite, just hearing the sinister tone was enough for Mason to feel a chill. It was no wonder that the 9th rank mage felt so resentful of Mason. He truly had been led into a hole by that bastard. "You can't just stick to reading when you're in the library? Do you want to cause trouble everywhere? And you even had to provoke someone that alarmed the 3 big shots." "It's fine if you are courting death, but why are you involving me?" As he stewed in his thoughts, the library manager became more and more upset. I truly only had suspicions." As he was being led away by the 9th rank mage, Mason was still trying to defend himself. Unfortunately for him, no one wanted to listen to what he was saying anymore. When those 2 left the library, Lin Yun had already flipped his way through more than half of Nocent history. This was actually a time transmigration of 30,000 years. Lin Yun slowly closed the book. He didn't need to look at the rest of the contents. If the history he knew of wasn't wrong, the current period should be shortly after the destruction of the 3rd dynasty. Mankind had just recently started the era of plain colonization, and there were about 30,000 years left until the eventual destruction of Nocent. This was a truly great era. Nocent's glorious magic civilization started during the colonization era. Countless resources passed through the colonies and endlessly flew towards Nocent. The magic civilization expanded at a crazy speed, the power and the ambitions of mages increased accordingly, and the magic system was overturned time and time again. The magic civilization was pushed towards a peak that could never have been imagined before, all the way up until Nocent's mana was exhausted and the mages that could once be compared to gods fell back to being mortals. The formerly glorious magic civilization dimmed, and the world ended up being swallowed in flames and darkness. Of course, all this had yet to happen. Lin Yun put Nocent history back on the shelf and then took a book on the Jade formula. From this book, he could see that the Sage Tower truly had a rich collection. Lin Yun had read about the Jade formula in the Decade Library in the End of Time. That place had been said to contain the last embers of the magic civilization. The books that could be stored there, even in a corner, were definitely quality books among quality books. Naturally, the 2 versions of the Jade formula had huge differences. This was normal, since the one that Lin Yun had read about had been refined by countless mages over countless years. It had already been revised close to the point of perfection. Compared to that, the book in his hands could be considered a semi-finished product at best. But to Lin Yun, it didn't matter whether it was only semi-finished or not. He knew the perfected Jade formula so well that even if he had the finalized version in front of him, it would be a bit of review. What Lin Yun wanted to do with this Jade formula was to judge the magical knowledge of this era and what kind of level it had reached. This would let Lin Yun better understand the period that he was now in. A book on Nonsense history wasn't enough. In fact, Lin Yun's only knowledge of this era so far was the point in history that he was currently in. Nothing could be done about it. There were a lot of useful things in the end of the world, but that definitely didn't include a detailed record of history. In a world where surviving to the next day wasn't certain, who would want to pay attention to what had happened so long ago in the past? In fact, about 100 years after the mana was exhausted, Nonsense history had been almost completely severed. Lin Yun only knew about some major events that had been passed down by word of mouth through some stories. As for the details, as Lin Yun put it, all the conscientious historians died. Lin Yun sighed and focused his attention back onto the Jade formula. Chapter 12, Get Him Out of Here. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. At that time, someone knocked on the door of the reception room on the top floor of the Sage Tower. 3 people were sitting in the reception room, 1 old, 1 middle-aged, and 1 young. The old one was wearing a grey gown. He had a grizzled beard and thin figure and was issuing a few coughs from time to time, his body seeming to be in poor shape. In comparison, the middle-aged man sitting in front of him seemed a lot more lively, his hair and beard meticulously combed. And although the clothes he wore seemed neither luxurious nor ostentatious, the exquisite clothing was finely handcrafted. A person with a discerning eye would notice that they had been made by a famous tailor. It was highly possible that this set of clothes was worth enough to pay for the expenses of an ordinary family for an entire year. The youth sitting to the side wasn't even 30 years old. But the shocking part was that the cuffs of his black gown had some thin, silver lines. In other words, this was a great mage that was less than 30 years old. But in this reception room, whether it was the rich middle-aged man or the young great mage, they both had a very respectful attitude towards the old man. This was because that old man was the leader of Thousand Sails City Mage Guild, one of the 3 big shots of the Sage Tower, Solomon. In Thousand Sails City, the 3 big shots of the Sage Tower were legendary existences. They would rarely appear in public, and in the past few years, almost no one had ever caught sight of them. People only knew that these 3 powerful mages who were jointly controlling the Sage Tower had been on the path of growing as high mages for the past dozen years or so, and that they had deep and unmeasurable strength. Their existences were the sole reason that the Mage Guild towered above Thousand Sails City. No one would challenge the Mage Guild. Who would dare to face the fury of 3 high mages? It would be a joke. It had to be known that they weren't some kind and benevolent elders. Back in the days, the outstanding and vicious bandit group called Blackwing was burnt to ashes by these 3 big shots. That bandit group had consisted of more than 1,000 people, but ultimately, no one was left alive. Coming. The knocking sound had interrupted the discussion between the 3 men. The old man could only smile apologetically at his 2 guests. President Monchai, Mage Ryan, I'm sorry for the disturbance. The one who opened the door was a young mage that was perhaps almost 30. If Lin Yun were there, he would definitely be able to recognize him at first sight. That young mage had been in the library earlier, and when Mason was taken away, he had thrown a few curious glances at Lin Yun. After entering, the young mage first apologized to the 2 guests before whispering a few words into Solomon's ear. Okay, I understand. After listening to the young mage's report, Solomon merely nodded and did not give the young mage a real response. In fact, he turned towards the 2 guests with an apologetic smile. I'm truly sorry, President Monchai, a problem happened in the library. The library? When Monchai heard that, his eyelids twitched a little. Isn't Mason in the library right now? How could Monchai not know of his son's character? Usually taking advantage of his family's influence, he didn't have any scruples doing anything he wanted. And with Mage Ryan's help, he had recently advanced and become a new mage. Feeling burgeoning pride in his recent success, he became even more arrogant, to the point that at the last gathering of the 7 Chambers of Commerce, he had casually found an excuse to punch Loch Merlin's son, almost creating a huge problem. Currently, he had poured a huge amount of money into drawing up a plan to cooperate with the Sage Tower, sending his son to the library in the meantime, as he had felt that it was less likely to come into conflict with anyone when everyone there was just quietly reading. Before he left, he had specially warned his son that the Sage Tower wasn't just any place. He couldn't act arrogant there or he would bring a lot of trouble to the family. As he thought of what might have happened, Monchai couldn't help having a headache. Sometimes, he really couldn't understand. They were both his sons. So why was the difference between Mason and Ryan so great? One was steady and shrewd, managing to become a great mage at a young age, while the other was always only stirring up trouble. Even his eventual breakthrough to become a mage had only been accomplished through relying on his older brother. After he returned this time, he would properly discipline Mason. Otherwise, if it kept going, he would bring a great disaster to the family. Monchai hesitated for a while before forcing himself to ask, "Leader Solomon, did Mason?" "Don't mind it, it was a minor issue." Solomon waved his hand, his smile still on his face. "A disagreement happened between Mason and a young mage just now in the library. It's not that big of a deal. Solon took care of it." "I am truly ashamed." Monchai repeatedly apologized while relaxing somewhat. Hearing Solomon's tone, it seemed that, thankfully, Mason must not have provoked an important mage of the Sage Tower. If that was the case, giving Solomon a suitable apology and then paying his respects to the Sage Tower should be enough. As for that young mage, it would be better for him to be tactful. If he wanted to get into trouble with someone, he should know who he was talking to. The Monchai family wasn't one to be trifled with. The only thing that mattered now was the attitude of the Sage Tower, but it seemed that there was not much problem with it. After all, he had brought up the cooperation plan, so he should have a lot of sway for the Sage Tower right now. At this crucial moment, Solomon would give him some face despite his son's actions. Just as Monchai expected, Solomon quickly accepted his apologies and didn't talk further about Mason's faults. Afterwards, the discussion continued quite pleasantly and was no longer just limited to business talk. It wasn't so stiff anymore, so the atmosphere in the reception room naturally became more harmonious, sounding more like old friends were talking. Solomon even talked about some of his past experiences. He was someone who had been a high mage for more than a dozen of years. After all, his experiences were legends for many people. Regardless of whether it was the extremely wealthy Monchai or the great mage Ryan who broke through before even reaching 30, they both listened, enraptured, as these stories were an eye-opener to them. When leaving, Solomon surprisingly also accompanied them to the door. This was a rarely seen treatment and was happening for the first time in years. After seeing off the father and son, Solomon returned to the reception room once again. Solon, who had been waiting there the whole time, carefully asked, "Teacher, should I appease Mason?" Solon assumed that since his teacher had talked so happily with this father and son duo for all this time, the Sage Tower and the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce would most likely finalize the cooperation agreement, and the young Mason who had been driven away from the library might need to be appeased. He was Monchai's son after all. If he made too much noise, it might not bring any benefit to the imminent partnership. Solon hadn't expected that after sitting down, the old man would fire off such sharp words. "What do you mean, appease? Get him out of here." Chapter 13, Here We Go Again. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. What? Causing trouble in the library is definitely an affront to the dignity of the Mage Guild. Not breaking his legs is already letting him off easy. Oh right, if that Monchai comes to look for me tomorrow, you can tell him that I went to Alana and that I will take 10 days. No, I should come back in a month. Solon didn't even know how to react to this. What's happening? Didn't teacher change his attitude way too quickly? Wasn't he chatting very happily just now? Why did he suddenly become so hostile and tell me to get Mason out of here? And then afterwards, he no longer even welcomes Monchai himself. Isn't this a bit irrational? You seem rather confused about this. Speaking of that, it's not without reason that you took so long to advance to Great Mage. You are not using your brain properly. Why do you think I chatted that pair of father and son so much? Isn't it because I don't want to hear about their proposition? If not for the sake of those old guys of the Black Tower, I would have already kicked them out too. But why, teacher? Didn't you say before that the cooperation with Monchai was truly advantageous, that it would bring benefits to our Sage Tower without bringing any troubles? Solomon hadn't explained his sudden change of heart, and thus, Solon couldn't understand. That was before. Solomon looked at his disciple unhappily, a sneer appearing on his old face. That father-son pair really thinks that I'm clueless because I'm old. Loch Merlin's shipwreck last month definitely had the shadow of the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce behind it. This time, Solon didn't say anything. He only glanced at the old man while having some doubts in his heart. Loch Merlin's death was a month ago and you are only just now thinking of fighting for justice. Since when did you become so righteous? Why are you looking at me like that? Solomon suddenly flew into a rage, viciously lashing out at his disciple. Are you implying that I, your teacher, am not a man of justice? That's why you spent so long to become a great mage. It really makes sense. You really can't understand the path your teacher is teaching you. No, teacher, you misunderstand. Faced with such vicious scolding, the young great mage was quickly driven to the verge of tears. Forget it. This isn't important. Solomon waved his hand and let his only disciple off the hook for now. What's important is that the owner of the pass is Loch Merlin's son. Since that's the case, I need to be righteous here. Why is that? Because that pass was granted for an alchemy potion. You mean, the alchemy potion that we received a few days ago? As Solomon's only disciple, Solon naturally knew that a few days ago, someone had brought a potion to the Sage Tower and exchanged it for the pass that granted the highest privileges. But Solon still wasn't clear about the details of the potion. Even hearing Solomon talk about it now, he still felt a bit unconvinced. That potion is that important. If you dare to ask that in front of Thorpe, he will be happy to air dry you until you shrivel up and then turn you into an experiment. The young great mage immediately shrank back. Great alchemist Thorpe, one of the 3 people in charge of the Sage Tower. If he really wanted to turn him into an experiment, then even his teacher's reputation might not stop him. That was the only dangerous person in the entire Sage Tower that would dare to curse in front of his teacher's desk. However, after the initial twinge of fear, Solon couldn't help feeling curious. What kind of potion would make the 3 big shots so interested? Originally, Solon had guessed that this potion might have used some precious materials or might have been something that one of them had needed for a long time. But Solon definitely didn't expect that it would be so serious. Serious was the wrong word. Would Thorpe really have made him into an experiment for questioning the importance of that potion? I'm not just trying to frighten you. You just haven't seen old Thorpe's reaction. Excited wasn't enough to describe him when he held that potion bottle. He was stuttering and stammering as he shouted something masterpiece, something great master, something bound to be written in history books, and so on. In any case, he was in a bizarre state. The young mage became even more intrigued. Thorpe was a publicly known figure with the greatest achievements in potion-earing in the entire Thousand Sails city. And he had always set his gaze very high. Even that great alchemist of the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce didn't enter his sight, as he had always been disdainful of both predecessors and newcomers. For many years, Solon had rarely heard him give anyone the slightest bit of praise. Just hearing the words acceptable from him was already an honor. But he actually lost control of himself. Even talking about it being written in future history books. Was that potion really that miraculous? He wondered. You know me, I'm not an expert in potion-earing alchemy. Solomon glanced at his disciple, giving him a rather irresponsible answer to his unspoken question. In any case, I heard Thorpe say that each bottle of this alchemy potion might bring another great mage to the Sage Tower. Just as he finished this sentence, Solon couldn't help sucking in cold air. What was all this about great master, masterpiece, and history books? The matter of great mages was far easier to understand. The Sage Tower had a total of 13 great mages, of which only 7 resided there permanently. The big 3 had usually remained in seclusion for most of the past decade, and the Sage Tower's external expansion, fights over resources, and other conflicts were simply in the hands of these 7 great mages. In other words, The current Sage Tower's status was half established by these great mages. That was the case with 7 great mages. If it really was like Thorpe had said, and each bottle of potion was able to bring a great mage to the Sage Tower, then Solon really didn't dare to imagine what kind of scene it would be. It was no exaggeration to say that any power that could obtain the favor of that great alchemist might easily be able to rival the Sage Tower in Thousand Sails City. This was a factor that the 3 big shots had taken into account. If that person had a way to restrain the 3 of them, then destroying the Sage Tower might be as easy as waving his hand. Thinking of this, cold sweat dripped down Solon's forehead. The bright side was that the great alchemist apparently seemed to prefer remaining inconspicuous. He hadn't made his plans public yet, whatever they were. Otherwise, he wouldn't have had a young mage deliver the potion and then gifted the pass to another young mage. The key to figuring these things out should be these 2 young mages, especially that Mather Merlin. He should have a rather close relationship with the creator, or else the alchemist wouldn't have given him the pass. No wonder Teacher would have such an attitude, Solon concluded. If it really was like Teacher said and the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce was linked to Loch Merlin's shipwreck in a bad way, and their plot was brought out to light, then that Chamber of Commerce might face the fury of an incredible great alchemist apostrophe. As Solon considered the idea, Solomon concluded their discussion. Knowing the current situation, only a fool would cooperate with the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce. The young mage suddenly sympathized with that father-son pair. In order to cooperate with the Sage Tower, they had prepared for half a year and accepted all kinds of conditions, but in the end, it wasn't as good as a single potion. Okay, I told you everything that you needed to know about this, so you decide how to handle it. Don't always rely on me. You'll take over my seat sooner or later. After all, it'll be good for you to learn how to deal with these kinds of matters. Yes, I'll take care of it. A month passed. Ever since that conversation in the reception room, Solon had felt that paying close attention to that young mage was an absolute must. From his observations, Solon found out that this young mage was truly interesting. His range of reading material was really vast. From light reading material about Nocent's history to the profound and abstract knowledge of the Jide formula, he would casually hold a book and read it all day long. Sometimes, Solon even doubted whether there was any sort of criteria for the books he picked out, or if he was just reading for the sake of reading. Quite a few times, Solon wanted to remind him that the chance to enter the Sage Tower's library really was a rare opportunity. Many mages would even sell their entire family fortune for the chance, while he didn't seem to be cherishing it, picking random books every day, completely without rhyme or reason, sometimes reading them with great interest as though he was just reading for fun. Solon wanted to tell him that he might one day regret treating this opportunity so lightly, and today was such a day. Solon went to the library after breakfast. As always, he glanced at a particular corner because he knew that every day at this time, that young mage would sit at the same desk and would spend the whole day reading after casually picking up a book. Sure enough, when Solon glanced there, that young mage was already sitting at his seat, holding a book with a red striped cover and reading it with great interest. Here we go again, Solon sighed. It didn't seem to be light reading today, but in Solon's eyes, this wasn't too different from light reading. The red stripes on the cover meant that the knowledge of the magic book was at least great mage level. For a recently advanced first-rank mage, how could it not be leisure reading? Moreover, it wasn't the first time Mather had done something like that. Solon even saw him reading a silver-striped magic book with great interest once. That was preposterous, as that meant that the contents included knowledge on the level appropriate for high mages. Solon really couldn't stand watching anymore. How could a mage who wasn't respectful of knowledge itself have any accomplishments in magic? Even a book that only great mages were qualified to read was just leisure reading material to him. He definitely wasn't pondering over the information, as he wasn't even taking notes or pausing. He was simply flipping through page after page with a pleased expression on his face, to the point that Solon even wondered if he was trying to study at all, or just relaxing. Solon would have been astounded if he discovered that he had actually guessed correctly this time. Chapter 14, reaching beyond his grasp. This chapter is updated by Novels.pl. Lin Yan truly had tired himself out this month. In order to quickly understand the current era, Lin Yan had swept across more than a dozen bookshelves. Such frightening reading speed. If someone else had tried that, their mind might have already melted. When Lin Yan walked into the library today, he decided to take a rest day and not overwork his brain with the relatively dry and uninteresting historical knowledge or the task of comparing the magic knowledge of the two different eras. He decided to look for a relaxing book to pass time. Thus, Lin Yan picked up a book called The Fenrisen Formula. To Lin Yan, these books that were intended for Great Mage were nothing more than leisure reading material. It definitely didn't require much brain power for him to read page after page. From time to time he would find some mistakes inside and would mutter to himself, criticizing the errors. Sitting under the gentle rays of the sun, reading a light book while scolding the author, truly a beautiful life. Tsitsi, a high mage that doesn't know right from wrong. He still believes in that superstitious 7-string theory, shrinking the mana whirlpool and cross-arranging. Such a mess. What is a mess? When Solon approached, he happened to hear that last part and couldn't help giving that young mage a strange look. Good morning, Mage Solon. Nothing is a mess, did you mishear? How could Lin Yan own up to his words just now? He just raised his head and answered, playing dumb. Is that so? Solon smiled and did not comment. He didn't pursue that line of questioning, as he felt that it didn't really matter. He had come over to give some reminders to this young mage out of goodwill, after all. Perhaps it was because he had gotten his past too easily, but this young mage wasn't treasuring it at all, and whether it was the way he chose books or his attitude while reading these books, they both seemed too casual, lacking the proper seriousness. He might not feel anything about it now, but in a few years, when he strove to attack the Great Mage realm, he would definitely feel regret that he wasn't conscientious enough back then. As someone who was more experienced and who could be considered part of an older generation, Solon really didn't want to see something like this happening. Sometimes, if the opportunity was missed, it couldn't be grasped again and it would be too late for anything but useless regrets. Mage Merlin, that Solon started talking, before hesitating a bit. Although this person was merely a first-rank mage, behind him most likely stood a great alchemist. Naturally, he couldn't lecture him in a way that might draw his ire. What? After a slight pause, Solon answered, it's not an important matter. I just came over to ask if Mage Merlin had any requests. You are one of the noble guests with the highest pass, so if you have any requests, we will definitely satisfy your needs. After this polite opening, Solon stopped and suddenly said, oh right, Mage Merlin, I wonder if you need some book recommendations? I've worked here for 2 years and could be considered to have some understanding of the books here. Solon felt a bit helpless about having to be so polite to a first-rank mage. He couldn't do anything about it, since there might be a hidden great alchemist behind this fellow. In this situation, even his teacher Solomon didn't want to act without thinking. Even if he wanted to give him a suggestion, he could only recommend it very tactfully. He had to consider the consequences. After all, if he was too direct, he might exasperate this young mage, and who knew what kind of temperament he might have. Thus, Solon could only inwardly sigh. I've given you the opportunity. It's up to you whether you grab it or not. How could I trouble you with that? Lin Yan felt that this was a bit of an annoyance. He had finally decided to take a rest day. What kind of recommendation can you give me? Are you disturbing me on purpose? But declining was no good because Lin Yan could tell that this library manager really had good intentions. Thus, Lin Yan could only say a few polite words while inwardly considering what kind of excuse he could use to brush him off. Mage Merlin is truly too polite. Regardless of anything else, you are an esteemed guest of our Sage Tower, so offering you a bit of help is definitely something we should do. The young great mage then started enthusiastically introducing a few books. You should be a first-rank mage, right? If you are interested, I would recommend you to study Gord's notes. Those notes were left behind by Archmage Gord, the last Archmage of the Third Dynasty. He recorded all his experiences during his progress through the Mage realm. Oh right, Farrell's Conjectures is another interesting read. Although many of his theories have already been proven to be wrong, I personally feel that the way he pondered through novel ideas with a wild imagination is worth learning from. Sure, I'll go take a look later. Despite this young great mage being very passionate about the matter, to Lin Yan, these recommendations really weren't worth mentioning. They were too shallow and were for complete beginners. They couldn't even be leisure reading materials for him. Reading through them would only have a hypnotic effect, making him drowsy. Okay, and if these don't interest you, then I would suggest that you research the Flame Spear spell. That's the spell closest to Great Mage level spells. You might need it in the future. Sensing that the other side was answering perfunctorily, Solon's tone became harsher. He especially emphasized the last word, future, to remind him that he was but a mere first-rank mage now. Unfortunately, Lin Yan had no reaction after hearing that. In fact, the mention of the Flame Spear spell made him remember something else. Oh right, Mage Solon, I heard that the Sage Tower seems to have collected the full Starpath incantation. I wonder if I could be allowed to broaden my horizons? If there were any spells in this era that could interest Lin Yan, Starpath would be one of them. Even at the peak of the magic civilization countless years later, those powerful mages still had a very high assessment of that particular incantation. Lin Yan had actually seen the Starpath incantation in that decaying library, but that one had already passed through countless edits and revisions. Lin Yan had never seen the original version. Starpath. Solon almost laughed out loud when he heard that. It was true that the Sage Tower had collected the entire Starpath incantation, but that spell was on the level of forbidden magic. Even if the big three joined hands, nothing would come of it. How could a mere first-rank mage dare to think about it? Not knowing whether he should laugh or cry, Solon answered once again, but he wasn't as polite as before. Mage Merlin, don't you think it's a bit too early for you to study Starpath now? What I say might not be pleasant to hear, but you are a first-rank mage. There aren't that many books suitable for you in this library, and so the choices that would be proper for you are really limited. There is no one that can jump through into the heavens of the magic world in a single step. Even if I arranged the Starpath in front of you, would you be able to understand any of the runes? Lin Yan very much wanted to answer that he would indeed be able to understand them. I have seen them so many times. How could I not understand them? Unfortunately, the young mage didn't give him the opportunity to answer. Well, Mage Merlin, I still have something to take care of, so I'll take my leave. Solon exited the library with a belly full of grievances, and after thinking for a bit, he once again returned to the study at the top floor of the Sage Tower. Solomon was sitting by the fireplace, a grey blanket covering his thin body, a magic book propped open across his knees, with a fierce cough bursting out from time to time. Teacher's body is getting worse apostrophe. Solon sighed inwardly when he entered. Solomon had been seriously injured 20 years ago. This was a secret that only a few people of the Sage Tower knew about. Most mages didn't know what had originally caused his condition. It was because of this serious injury that Solomon had lived a life of seclusion for so many years, his strength stopping at the peak of High Mage, unable to break through. Teacher, your cough is getting worse. Should I ask High Mage Thorpe to make a few potions for you? Thorpe's potions are too unpleasant to drink. I don't want to drink those horrors. In any case, it's been so many years and my body still hasn't failed yet. Understood. Solon had a sad expression. Solomon's condition was the thorn in the minds of all the mages of the Sage Tower. Everyone hoped for the High Mage to recover soon, but no one found an effective remedy. Even the great alchemist Thorpe had tried for 2 years before having no other choice but to give up. He was only able to refine a few potions for Solomon from time to time to lessen the pain when his condition flared up. In fact, Solomon himself didn't really take it to heart. Oh right, you came from the library? How are things with that young mage, Merlin? Still the same. He would come first every day and leave last. You have been in contact for so long. What do you think of that young mage? He behaves very well, and he is very smart and courteous, but he seems to be reaching for what is beyond his grasp. Solon thought about what had happened in these past days, hesitated for a while, but then finally explained, oh right, today he looked at a book on the Fenruzan formula. When I went over, I seemed to have heard him saying that it was a mess. Chapter 15, Cut It Out Already. This chapter is updated by Novels.pl. A mess. Solon carefully thought back to what he had heard and hesitantly continued. It seemed to be about the seven-string theory. It had only been some mumbles under the breath, and Solon himself hadn't taken it to heart. However, he hadn't expected that these words would make the old mage resting with his eyes closed suddenly sit up straight and give him a sharp look. Are you saying that he looked at the Van formula and assessed that the seven-string theory was a mess? Yes, that should be what he said, more or less. Solon was a bit overwhelmed by his teacher's sudden reaction. That's not completely implausible. Solomon smiled and then chanted an incantation. A bony finger softly slid through the air as huge amount of mana gathered at his fingertip. A light that was visible to the naked eye streaked across the air in front of him, and immediately after, the entire region of space before him seemed to be torn apart, exposing a curtain made of white light. In this light curtain, a young mage was sitting at a desk, leisurely looking at a book, a smile appearing on his face from time to time while he seemed to be mumbling some things to himself. This was a replay of everything that had happened in the library earlier. The High Mage's temporal recall could even track a scene that had happened more than 10 years ago, let alone a scene that had just taken place nearby. Of course, the more recent the event, the clearer the scene would be. Even now, the scene in the light curtain was so clear that each hair of the young mage could be clearly seen. Even Solon had no problem seeing all the details from behind his teacher. That young mage was holding the book about the Van formula, flipping through the pages very quickly while having a weird smile plastered on his face, as if he was looking at something ridiculous. What is so ridiculous about it? The young Solon thought for a long time, but he couldn't understand. But the High Mage before him seemed to have noticed something as amazement suddenly appeared on his old face. When he reached the 12th page of the book, the young mage on the light curtain put the book down, and the smile on his face seemed even more derisive as he mumbled some things while face-palming. At first, Solomon's face was filled with amazement, but when he realized what the young mage had mumbled, the High Mage suddenly paled, and the right hand casting the temporal recall suddenly shook, causing the curtain of white light to flicker, making the image lose focus. Teacher, you the young great mage was worried. It was the first time in many years that he had seen his teacher forget himself in the Sage Tower. It's nothing. Solomon shook his head as he scattered the temporal recall spell, which had already lost its stability. Okay, you leave first, I need to think about something. Yes, teacher. After Solon walked out, the study became quiet once again. Solomon sat still for a bit before getting up. He went to a desk at the edge of his room and sat down to begin writing a letter. This letter was written to Star Sage Dewey, one of the 3 archmages of the East. He was also the one who had taught Solomon for 20 years. Solomon wrote down everything he had just seen while using temporal recall. Solomon didn't tell Solon that Mavamerlin wasn't the first mage who had said that the seven-string theory was a mess. The words had made Solomon remember that he had heard at least one other mage say that before, and that was Star Sage Dewey. A few years ago, there had been some research done on the seven-string theory in the Cloud Tower, and the one in charge of that task was the Star Sage. At that time, he had said the same words, that the seven-string theory was simply a mess. It had sent who knew how many mages down a winding road. But the research into the seven-string theory in the Cloud Tower didn't make much progress. They lacked a few crucial pieces of data, causing the whole project to stagnate. But just now, upon seeing the 12th page of the Van formula, that young mage had mumbled a few sentences to himself. Temporal recall didn't reproduce any sounds, so Solomon didn't actually hear what the young mage had said. However, he had become very good at lip reading because of how often he had used this spell. The mage had muttered something in the Nessa language. His words contained 4 key pieces of data, and those 4 might be the key points that could prove the seven-string theory wrong. This was why Solomon had been so agitated. After finishing the letter, Solomon sealed the envelope and called for Solon to come back in. Send this letter to the Cloud Tower. It is for Star Sage Dewey. Yes, I will ensure that it is done. Oh right, tomorrow when Mavamerlin comes, invite him here. I have some things I want to ask him. I will, teacher. When Solon withdrew from the study room once again, His mind was full of doubts and amazement. After all, Solomon's study wasn't a place that just anyone could enter. Even Monchai and Ryan had only been invited to the reception room. One of them was a rich businessman of Thousand Sails City and the other was a great mage that wasn't even 30 yet. And they had came with a huge plan that had been prepared for months. What was so special about that young mage? But the comment about the mess had made his teacher lose his self-control and fail to maintain the temporal recall. And now he was even inviting that young mage to his study for a chat. In the end, Lin Yun didn't go to the library the next day. That day was the day of the Gilded Rose's reopening. With the 30,000 gold from the auction, the old butler was a lot more relaxed. Not only had they settled Fario's debt, but the butler had even begun to draw up plans for the revival of the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce. Lin Yun originally didn't want to worry too much about it. 30,000 wasn't that big of a number, and he could just casually buy some magic materials to deal with the daily expenses. But reviving the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce, wasn't that a bit too much? But the old butler couldn't wait to settle that matter. After Lin Yun turned him down a few times, the old butler began to act like a rascal. He would sigh every day within Lin Yun's hearing range, talking about how he was getting on in his years and that he knew he didn't have long to live. If he suddenly departed and met the old master in the heavens, would he have to explain that after so many years of flourishing, the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce was now on the verge of death? In the end, Lin Yun had no choice but to make concessions. There was no point mentioning the revival of the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce yet, but the Gilded Rose could actually be reopened almost immediately. Thus, the 20-some thousand gold that was left over was put into renovation, employee recruitment, and material purchases. Not much remained of the money. The old butler was left dumbfounded. What can we do? We have no money left. What about the alchemist? An alchemist workshop without an alchemist? What difference is there from opening a restaurant without a chef? When this matter had come to light, the old man had gained a few more white hairs. Nothing could be done about it, since alchemists had very high status. Even if all the 20,000 gold had been used for it, it would only have been enough to pay for the wages of a peak alchemist for perhaps 2 months, let alone now that they only had a few hundred gold left on hand. Did they have to hire apprentice alchemists to make it up? This would ruin their reputation. Since there was no other choice, Lin Yun had to personally act. After coming out from the Sage Tower the day before, Lin Yun did not head straight home, instead heading to the alchemy laboratory of the Gilded Rose. He spent the entire night using the remain cheap materials to make a dozen potions, along with a few magic armors and magic weapons. As for magic tools, he was powerless to do anything about it. He was restricted by the shoddy materials. Even if Lin Yun had knowledge that transcended the era, he couldn't make miracles out of nothing. As for the grand reopening, there was no need for Lin Yun to worry about it. This was in the hands of the old butler. Lin Yun simply handed over the results of one night of work before finding a room in the Gilded Rose to sleep. After spending the night hard at work, even an energetic alchemist wouldn't be able to handle it. Lin Yun's mana whirlpool was far more robust than that of ordinary mages, while his mind had the knowledge of alchemy far beyond the people of this era. Many problems that his contemporaries would be unable to settle were casual matters in his hands. But even if that was the case, this night had exhausted all of Lin Yun's energy, as the mana whirlpool within his body had been working on overload, almost exhausting his reserves. It was quite nice to be able to lie down for some rest. He kept sleeping through the afternoon, and when the sun was about to set, Lin Yun was woken up by a loud sound. "Someone is courting death," Lin Yun said, still half asleep, before turning to face the other side to try to rest a bit more. But it seemed that the person outside was deliberately set against him. Before he even finished trolling over, he heard a loud bang come from outside. It wasn't from the door, but from the sales counter. "Cut it out already." This time, Lin Yun could no longer bear with it and angrily got out of bed, dressing himself and heading for the door. "I want to see who dares to cause trouble here." After entering the hall, he saw a group of people in a circle. A shelf had been knocked down, the counter had been smashed, and the recently decorated hall was left in a complete mess. A few employees were already ducking on the side while the old butler was arguing loudly with that group. One young mage seemed especially conspicuous. "Smash everything. You dare sell fake items to me? Don't look at me like that. You think that I'm easy to bully? I'll let you know, old geezer, if you don't hand Merlin to me right now, not only will I smash this thieving shop, I'll report it to the Chambers of Commerce Union and have Thousand Sales City's people take a look at how shameless the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce is. Get the hell out, this place doesn't welcome you." The old butler had followed Loch Merlin for 20 years. He considered the reputation of the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce more important than his own life. Hearing Mason insulting the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce, the old man burst in anger, and regardless of whether they were customers or not, he raised his hands to push Mason towards the exit. The old butler was an ordinary person, so even if he had been 20 years younger, he wouldn't have been able to threaten a mage. But Mason simply wasn't paying attention to the old butler, being too excited, gesticulating and splattering saliva while shouting, and thus, he was shoved back, causing him to stumble. "Old geezer, you dared to hit me?" This time, Mason had an even nastier expression. A mighty mage was almost pushed down by a 60-year-old butler. If this spread, would anyone still respect him? Chapter 16, Apology and Compensation. This chapter is updated by Novels.pl. After recovering from staggering, a fierce glint appeared in Mason's eyes and the magic staff in his hand was activated, the gem at the end letting out fierce mana fluctuations. "Give it a try." Lin Yun had already arrived during the argument, and although there was a smiling expression on his face, the mana fluctuations around him let everyone know that if Mason dared to make a move, the young master would definitely not be polite. "Merlin, you came just on time." As he saw Lin Yun appear, Mason didn't dare to attack the old butler, but he still kept his overbearing attitude. "I came with good intentions and brought friends for your Gilded Roses reopening to give you some business. But I didn't expect you to be selling fake items. My friend just drank your potion and has some problems. You should compensate him. I know that this Dragon Eye gem is quite precious, but you don't need to raise it that high for me to see." After Lin Yun drew closer, he first pushed away Mason's magic staff before casually asking, "Which potion did your friend drink for him to have a problem?" "It was that healing potion." Mason unhesitantly answered. He had asked around before, and healing potions were truly first-rate potions. There weren't that many alchemists in Thousand Sales City that could craft effective healing potions, and they all had high status. They weren't people that the current Gilded Rose could hire. Moreover, that healing potion was dark red. Only failed healing potions were dark red. Take a look. He already drank more than half of the potion and his injury didn't improve at all. Moreover, the wound that had already been scabbing started bleeding again. Mason made his subordinates bring a stretcher while explaining. A young person that was perhaps in his late 20s was lying on the stretcher. His right arm was wounded, and after opening the bandage, a deep and long cut was revealed. And from the bloodstains and the residue, it was evident that it had truly been healing before splitting open. "I know you have no money right now and can't even afford your uncle's debt, but surely it wouldn't be good to use that as an excuse. For the sake of our friendship, I'll ask my father if he can help you." "But what about the fake potions?" Mason had a grieving and sorrowful expression, but he was inwardly gloating. "You dared to humiliate me in the Sage Tower, so today I'll destroy your workshop and humiliate you in public." Indeed, that so-called friend was someone I spent a few hundred gold to hire. He agreed for me to cut open the wound on his right arm. As for that healing potion, I already had people throw half of it away. The remaining half should be good enough as evidence. With the testimony of that guy and the potion, you will be the one suffering. Mason felt that Maffa's fate was as good as sealed. "What will you do? Planning on saying that this healing potion is a real one?" "Such a joke. You could cheat other people, but you can only dream if you want to cheat me. The Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce has a great alchemist." He patted his chest and guaranteed that a dark red healing potion was definitely a failed product. "What do you think? I'm helpless. My friend suffered such a huge loss. What does your Gilded Rose think about that? I have a very simple suggestion. First is to compensate my friend. I guess 10,000 gold should be fine. If you can't procure it, then you are definitely lacking sincerity. In that case, you'll have to admit that the Gilded Rose sold him a fake potion that harmed him and then guarantee that no such things will ever happen again. Even Mason himself felt that the two conditions were harsh. The entire Thousand Sails city knew that the Flashing Gold Chamber of Commerce had gone bankrupt and that Lockmerlin's son wasn't able to pay the debt that he owed his uncle. How could he come up with 10,000 gold for compensation? Moreover, before the matter of the compensation was even settled, he still had to publicly apologize and admit that he sold a fake potion. That would truly be a great humiliation. After that, proudly raising his head in Thousand Sails City would be a dream for Mather Merlin. Of course, when those two conditions were put forward, Mason was already prepared to haggle over the amount of the compensation. When the time came, it would be fine as long as he insisted on the second condition. As for the 10,000 gold, he didn't care much about it, as he didn't lack money. The goal was to ruthlessly trample on that kid's pride. That sounds reasonable. Our Gilded Rose opened to do business, so if there really was a problem with that healing potion, offering compensation and apologizing is a matter of course. Who knew that Lin Yun would be extremely straightforward and not argue the matter at all? Even Mason, who had always been thinking about how to shame this guy to get his revenge, couldn't help freezing. He had prepared so many more arguments. How can he agree so quickly? Well, it doesn't matter, saving some effort is also good. Since that's the case, then hurry up and settle it. You should compensate and apologize. I still have things to do. I don't have time to chat with you. Hey, Mason, did you listen to me? I said, if there really was a problem with the healing potion, you should understand the meaning of this. Right? Or do I need to explain for you? What do you mean? Mason had an unpleasant expression. Looks like you really didn't understand. Lin Yun regretfully shook his head, inwardly cursing the standards of Nonsense compulsory education before very patiently explaining to Mason. What I mean is if there is an issue with that healing potion, we will definitely compensate and apologize, but if there is no issue with that healing potion, I wonder what Mage Mason plans to do. No problem. Mason lowered his head to look at that half-empty bottle of healing potion, and when he saw the unsightly dark red color, he steadied his resolve and declared, if there is no problem with that healing potion, I'll eat its bottle. Good. Lin Yun nodded and waved to an employee in a corner. You, please come over. That employee was about 20 years old. A faint mana fluctuation could be seen on his body. He should be someone who just became a magic apprentice. Nothing could be done about that, as studying magic was very expensive. An average person without a family background like Mather Merlin or Mason simply couldn't cope with such a huge expenditure, thus, most magic apprentices would look for work to ease the burden. What's your name? Boss, I'm called Remy. Very good, Remy. Do you want to get a raise of 100 gold to your salary starting next month? If you are willing, roll up your sleeve. Although the young apprentice rolled up his sleeve, his mind was in chaos. His current salary was only 100 gold, so how could his salary double just by rolling up his sleeve? Wasn't that too irrational? While he was thinking about it, he suddenly felt a sharp pain in his right arm. Remy felt a chill as he looked down and saw that his boss had given him a deep cut. Damn, I knew that an offer to double my salary couldn't be anything good. Good. Help me test the flavor of this healing potion. Lin Yun said as he handed over the remaining half of the potion. Don't just stare at it in a daze, drink it fast, I still have things to take care of. Chapter 17, You Must Act with Integrity. This chapter is updated by Novels.pl. Remy hesitated a bit, but he ultimately couldn't resist the temptation of having his salary doubled. He ground his teeth before drinking down more than half of the remaining contents of the potion while inwardly hoping, Boss, please don't cheat me. Before he could even finish his thought, the wound on his hand suddenly itched, and under his amazed gaze, the deep cut quickly healed at a visible speed. That healing potion is real. Along with Remy's surprised shout, the others also focused on the wound, especially Mason. His mouth was open, and he couldn't seem to close it. Fuck. How could a dark red healing potion be truly real? A dark red potion is a failed potion. That's what the great alchemist said. This is definitely some sort of trick. How about it, Mage Mason? Would you say that our Gilded Rose's healing potion is effective? Lin Yun talked in an unhurried voice, but the tone felt ear-piercing in Mason's ears. He thought for a bit and couldn't think of any other explanation for what had happened, so he glared with an angry expression. Mather Merlin, you definitely did something. How could a dark red healing potion really work? That must be it. That guy was one of your employees after all. Who knows what kind of trick you prepared? True. After listening to Mason, he nodded and agreed. This healing potion is being sold by the Gilded Rose, and an employee of the Gilded Rose just tested its effects. It does sound a bit too unfair. Good that you know. Mason cut in. He didn't expect that. Before he could even finish his words, a cracking sound came from under his feet. It was followed by a blood-curdling scream. A blood-red vine suddenly burst out from under Mason's feet. It was a bright red and carried a dense, bloody smell. That blood-red vine quickly wrapped its way around Mason, starting from his feet up until it covered his whole body. It constricted him very tightly, to the point that no matter how much Mason struggled or screamed, he couldn't stop the viper-like vine. The blood vine's spell. Someone exclaimed from the crowd. Indeed, the 5th rank blood vine's spell. This was a truly sinister spell. It was rumored to have come from a demon, and had been created based on the blood-sucking vines of the abyss. This magic created creeping tendrils that were just like the blood-sucking vines. Once they coiled around a target, their thorns would enter the target's body and greedily suck out the victim's blood. If the caster didn't stop the spell, the target would eventually be drained until they became a dried corpse. What do you think you are doing? When he thought about what would happen to him, Mason felt the fear of death for the first time, and his voice became hoarse and dry. Didn't I just explain? I agreed that having anyone from the Gilded Rose test the effectiveness of the potion is truly unfair. Thus, I believe having Mage Mason display the effects is a lot better. Lin Yun's voice was still perfectly calm. If not for having just seen it with their own eyes, who would have thought that such a gentle young man was using such a sinister spell? No, don't kill me. I will compensate. I'll apologize. To the panicked Mason, this smile was simply more frightening than any evil grin. Mason, who had never met any setbacks, was truly fearing for his life this time. The blood vines around him were coiling even more tightly as sharp thorns kept piercing his skin one after the other, his blood constantly being absorbed by the thorns. Mason already started feeling his body turning cold. Struggling, screaming, pleading. Mason looked like a sheep under a butcher's knife. Besides incoherently begging for forgiveness, there were only desperate shrieks and rough breathing. The subordinates brought by Mason tried to rescue him, but they couldn't break through the blood vines. Even without Lin Yun's direction, those crazily spreading blood vines were keeping them away. Soon, only a passionate red mass stood out in the room. Lin Yun unhurriedly remarked, Mage Mason truly loves making jokes. Why would I kill you? The Gilded Rose is open for business, and customers are kings. Killing is something that would never happen here. We are only having a friendly chat to check the effectiveness of this healing potion. Yes, check. At this time, Mason could only say that much, let alone testing the sketchy potion. Even if Lin Yun made him admit that he was a goblin, Mason wouldn't hesitate at all at this point. Good, now we can proceed with the testing. Lin Yun looked at Mason before softly lowering his right hand that had been controlling the blood vines spell. The tyrannical blood vines withdrew underground with a burst of magical fluctuations, disappearing in an instant, as if none of this had ever happened. It felt as if they had never even been there. Mason, who had just narrowly escaped death, was the only proof that those tyrannical blood vines truly had appeared. They had tightly coiled around him and pierced his skin with the sharp thorns, leaving numerous small cuts. At this moment, Mason looked as if he had been stung by a hive of bees. Just looking at him made people feel a bit nauseous. Blood was continuously flowing out, and in a short amount of time, a puddle of blood colored the ground. Mason seemed to be at his last breath as he was laying on the ground. Even if an outstanding doctor saw his condition, he would most likely be shaking his head while sending him home to prepare for his funeral. Lin Yun put the remaining dregs of the healing potion in front of Mason, and after looking once again to check Mason's wounds, he nodded with satisfaction. This kind of injury should be convincing enough. Everyone present, including the young apprentice who had been cut a moment ago, immediately felt cold when they heard that inhuman statement. Good. There, Mage Mason, I'll have to trouble you to drink this. Let us take a look at the effects. As Lin Yun supported him, Mason managed, with some difficulty, to right himself. He then struggled to drink what remained of the healing potion. The whole time, Mason didn't dare to look at Lin Yun. Those blood vines had definitely left him thoroughly frightened. The healing potion once again displayed its miraculous effects. Mason had only just drunk the last gulp, yet the bloody wounds had already started healing, and after no less than half an hour, Mason could be said to be as good as ever before. If not for his whole mage's gown still being in a mess, Mason could almost imagine that everything that had just happened was a nightmare. An extremely frightening nightmare. After finally waking from that nightmare, how could he dare to stay in the Gilded Rose? After his injury recovered completely, he was about to leave, crestfallen, with his subordinates. Hold on. But in the end, the nightmarish voice echoed once again, and Mason completely stiffened up. WHWH, what is it? Mason managed to get the courage to open his mouth, but his voice was still trembling. Mage Mason, isn't this a bit wrong? Didn't we come to an agreement? If this potion had a good effect, you would eat the bottle. Mage Mason, you can't be like this. You must act with integrity. Mason's face suddenly froze. Seeing that fist-sized potion bottle, Mason truly felt like his heart was dying. How is it, Mage Mason? Are you eating it yourself, or should I help you? Bon appetit. Chapter 18, Spell Extraction. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. Remy, help me take care of it. After Mage Mason is finished with his meal, don't forget to remind him to compensate our workshop for the losses, Lin Yun explained while yawning. He was truly too tired. His output from that whole night of work was equivalent to what many alchemists would need a month for, and he would need to sleep well for a few days to recover. Unfortunately, his idea to go back to sleep was instantly destroyed. Lin Yun had barely turned to leave when a commotion could be heard outside the Gilded Rose, followed by a young mage pushing the door open. This young mage was not yet 30, but surprisingly, the cuffs of his gown had a silver lining. His identity as a great mage was clearly visible. Many onlookers recognized him when he entered. There was only one great mage this young in the entire Thousand Sails city, Monchai's eldest son, Ryan. It was said that Ryan had displayed shocking magic gifts when he was young and that Monchai had originally planned to send him to Auckland Magic School, but when he was 15, a powerful master from the kingdom paid them a visit and then left with Ryan shortly after. That was 10 years ago, and fairly recently, Ryan, who had already become a great mage, returned to Thousand Sails City. Soon, everyone in Thousand Sails City was shocked. A great mage that had yet to reach his 30s, what kind of idea was that? This was a genius that might not even appear in 100 years. He would most likely be able to set foot into the High Mage realm, and at that time, he might become an existence that could walk shoulder to shoulder with those three of the Sage Tower. This sounded especially plausible after the news spread that Monchai and Ryan paid a visit to the Sage Tower and that Solomon, one of the big three, had personally seen them off. Ryan's reputation in Thousand Sails City became even more resounding. Who was Solomon? He was an existence that was close to being a living legend. For so many years, countless people had visited the Sage Tower, but how many had been personally sent off by Solomon? Those could be counted on the fingers of just one hand. Ryan's name spread throughout Thousand Sails City so quickly that it even surpassed that of his father, Monchai, the president of the Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce. Even those young magic apprentices who had just broken through and become mages already viewed him as their idol. The higher-ups of every major power were very courteous to Ryan, especially after they heard that Ryan still had yet to marry and wasn't engaged either. Some families with daughters had begun visiting Monchai to make overtures. Nothing could be done about all this attention. Becoming a great mage before even turning 30 was too dazzling. Even an idiot could understand understand that as long as he didn't run into some incredible obstacle, Ryan's prospects would inevitably be bright. Sooner or later, he would become a grand figure comparable to the top 3 of Sage Tower, or maybe even surpass them. Eventually standing alone at the peak of Thousand Sails City didn't seem impossible. And now, this young great mage with a shockingly impressive reputation was standing at the doorway of the Gilded Rose, dressed in a simple black gown, and besides the silver line on his cuffs, there was nothing extraordinary about him. When he saw Mason with pieces of glass in his mouth, his face didn't even display the slightest hint of anger, as if this person wasn't his younger brother, but a random passerby. Take him back. With Ryan's words, the hoodlums that Mason had brought with him felt as if they were granted amnesty, and they quickly helped Mason out. This time, Lin Yan only stood there, sizing up that young mage with a curious look. The Twin Moons Chamber of Commerce will compensate for the damage Mason caused you. Tell me the amount and I'll send someone to deliver it to you tomorrow. After Ryan entered, he only glanced at Lin Yan and didn't ask what happened or who was right or wrong. He just directly issued this statement instead. Ryan didn't care what this fledgling mage was thinking. As the widely lauded great mage, how could he care about what a newly advanced mage was thinking? As for you, you used the Bloodvine spell. That Bloodvine spell will be extracted. Ryan's words immediately changed the atmosphere. Spell extraction referred to the process of a mage transferring a spell onto an item at the cost of completely forgetting about it. That item could be a magic scroll, a piece of magic equipment, a magic gem, anything could do as long as it could hold mana. After transferring it, that item would obtain powerful magic ability and might completely inherit that spell ability. In Nocent's history, there had been several powerful magic tools that had been created that way. But the extraction process was extremely painful to a mage because this was equivalent to pulling the spell out from a mage's soul while still alive. To a mage, this kind of torture for the soul was far more terrible than any magical backlash. In history, those mages who voluntarily had their spells extracted had already reached their limits and had wanted to leave some heritage to their disciples or the later generations. With shocking willpower and endurance, they extracted the spells they were the proudest of from their souls. The number of mages who had done this of their own will, from the 3rd dynasty until now, might not even amount to 10. Ryan talked about it as if it was nothing and asked Lin Yan to have his spell extracted. Ryan, you are going too far. The old butler stood out with a face red from anger, shielding Lin Yan behind him. Ryan stood there looking at Lin Yan as if the old butler wasn't there. Mason was the one in the wrong, but the prestige of the Monchai family cannot be provoked. Mather Merlin, you should know that if I make a move, you'll feel even more pain. Mage Ryan, you said so much, but there is something I still haven't understood. Lin Yan gently nudged the old butler aside and then smilingly walked towards Ryan. What's the problem? Ryan frowned slightly. He didn't like that young mage's attitude. Lin Yan stood in front of Ryan, and after scrutinizing him closely, he asked him, "Are you awake?" Ryan didn't react at first, but he then was hardly able to keep his anger suppressed. "A little mage dares to ridicule me? You brought this upon yourself." Ryan fiercely raised his magic staff, and shocking mana fluctuations immediately filled the atmosphere before a vivid redder spread through the entire lobby. Amidst cracking sounds, countless blood vines crawled up from the ground. Their growth was quick and violent as they covered the lobby in the bloody color. The same blood vine spell in Ryan's hands and in Lin Yan's hands seemed completely different. This wasn't because Lin Yan's casting ability was inferior to Ryan's. It was the gap between a normal mage and a great mage being too huge. After a great mage got rid of the bindings of the mana whirlpool, their strength reached a whole new level. A completely different world. A mage that had yet to step on that path couldn't imagine how frightening the power of a great mage was. This kind of gap almost couldn't be breached. Regardless of how impressive one was at conducting mana, regardless of how skilled one was with metamagic or the process of casting spells, when faced with that immeasurably huge gap, these could all only be considered funny tricks. The earth-shattering vines instantly flooded the entire lobby. Everyone was enveloped by the frightening vines, and as long as Ryan sent out a bit of mana, the entire lobby would truly be covered in blood. In the eyes of this great mage, those below him weren't even worth mentioning. At that moment, startled shouts and cries for help echoed throughout the lobby. And even the old butler who always refused to admit defeat was now exposing an expression of fear. But Lin Yun, who stood in front of Ryan, had a smile on his face. The blood vines were spreading over from the center of the room, and despite the menacing bloody shadows, the smile on his face didn't change at all. All he did was flick his fingers, and a small flame came out of his fingertips. Among these overwhelming blood vines, that weak flame seemed like a rock thrown into an ocean, and it drifted to the ground while giving the feeling that it would stop burning any time. But then, a loud bang echoed. Just as the flame fell on the ground, a raging blaze flared up, as if someone had covered the ground in something inflammable. The faint flame turned into overflowing, raging fires as they burnt away the blood vines, and only those. In a short time, those large blood vines had all turned to ashes. This had all happened too fast to the point that no one was able to react. Shock was plastered on the faces of all the employees, and Ryan, who had just cast his blood vines spell, still had his arm outstretched as if trying to channel mana into his recently extinguished spell. Chapter 19, Slap. This chapter is updated by novels.pl. After that, a slap echoed out while everything else in the entire lobby remained silent. It was as if time had frozen. Ryan was tightly holding his magic staff, looking at this young mage in front of him, full of disbelief. That slap just now, where did that come from? As if to prove that this wasn't an illusion, another clear sound echoed out when Ryan had started thinking that it had been all a dream. Another slap. The group of newly hired clerks looked dumbfounded at the scene, blankly thinking, no way. When you are still half asleep like this, you should hurry back to bed instead of sleep talking in the Gilded Rose. You'll have to compensate for interfering with my business. Lin Yun delivered some stinging words after slapping him twice. The gap between a normal mage and a great mage was truly insurmountable. Even Lin Yun couldn't directly bridge that gap, but it was different for spells themselves. Lin Yun had more than a dozen ways to restrain the blood vines. 30,000 years later in Nocent, Lin Yun had even struggled with the pernicious abyssal blood-sucking vines. What was an insignificant imitation spell compared to that? Lin Yun didn't even need to use a spell. He just threw out a wisp of Mana Seal Fire. Even those vines from the abyss would be burnt cleanly. Mana Seal Fire was the nemesis of the blood-sucking vines. Just a bit would be able to scorch an ocean of blood-sucking vines into ashes. That wisp of Mana Seal Fire had been extracted from a Mana Seal Stone a few days ago by Lin Yun. He had wanted to use it to concoct a dose of burning panacea, but because Ryan had used the blood vines spell, he could only use up that wisp ahead of time. When he thought about this, Lin Yun felt extremely angry. If you want to help Mason out of his predicament, just do it. Why do you have to talk about the prestige of the Monchai family? Is that even as valuable as a wisp of my Mana Seal Fire? At this moment, Ryan was still completely stunned by the two slaps, or perhaps, terrified. He was in complete disbelief. How could he have been ruthlessly slapped by a newly advanced mage, and twice? What had just happened was too unexpected, to the point that Ryan even forgot to block or retaliate. He just stood there lifelessly, his gaze filled with confusion and bewilderment. How could this happen? Wasn't it said that the power of great mages surpassed the power of the normal ones by tenfold? Or even hundredfold? Isn't the gap between great mages and mages something that could never be bridged? This guy clearly only just became a mage. Why could he completely ignore my blood vines spell? How did he do that without even using a spell? How can he slap? Countless questions appeared in Ryan's mind, but he couldn't find a rational explanation. Let alone a rational explanation, he couldn't even find a single excuse to comfort himself. He clearly couldn't just say that he was not prepared or careless to make himself feel better. If an elephant was careless, could it still be tossed aside by an ant? It seemed like nobody in the lobby could move. Ryan stood there in a daze, anger gradually joining the confusion on his face. He wanted to use the blood vines spell once again to prove that this gap was truly unbridgeable. But those countless questions in his mind kept reminding him to not just act without thinking. During that time, the atmosphere in the lobby became even more strange and tense. But that strange atmosphere didn't last long. because someone pushed the door to come in. Mage Merlin, congratulations, the new arrival was Solomon's only disciple, Solon. With Solon's high status, the reopening of a workshop like the Gilded Rose wasn't worthy of his attention. Solon wasn't just Solomon's sole disciple, he was also the successor of the Sage Tower chosen by the respected High Mage himself. He would become the new leader of the Mage Guild sooner or later. He represented not only himself, but also Solomon, and even the entire Sage Tower. Even if he wanted to come to see this new shop, he would have to take into consideration the reactions of all the forces that might notice. But today was truly a bit special. After the discussion in the study yesterday, Solon decided that he would definitely have a proper discussion with that young mage the next day. Thus, Solon had waited in the library all day, but even after waiting for the whole morning, Lin Yun still didn't arrive. In the end, he felt so fidgety and impatient that he sent someone to inquire. Only then did he find out that it was the day of the Gilded Rose's grand reopening, so the young mage wouldn't be visiting the library today. This got Solon a bit worked up, who was thinking at the time, I have so many unsolved questions, how could you not come? Forget it, I'll visit you myself. Thus, Solon took 2 scrolls of the Sage Tower as a congratulatory gift and rushed to the Gilded Rose, burning with anxiety. The building itself seemed oddly damaged, but perhaps that was a choice of style. When he opened the door, Solon felt as if his brain had short-circuited. What happened? That young mage with both cheeks swelling, isn't he the famous son of the Monchai family? Great Mage Ryan of the Ash Tower? How could he look so awkward? Both sides of his face have clear red imprints. Has he been slapped by someone? That can't be. Besides, perhaps the big 3 of the Sage Tower, who would even be able to slap a great mage in Thousand Sails City? No, this must definitely be some sort of a magic ritual I don't know about. But in that case, why is Great Mage Ryan's expression so strange? Has he truly been slapped twice by someone? Oh right, there is also that young mage, Mapha Merlin. Why is he standing in front of a great mage smiling so leisurely like that? Isn't that attitude a bit too arrogant? As he processed this strange scene, Solon started feeling rather regretful. Why did I have to arrive with such timing? Such a tense atmosphere doesn't bode well for our interaction. Solon gulped awkwardly and forced himself to break this deadlock. Great Mage Ryan, such a coincidence. We haven't seen each other in a while, but you still look as elegant as last time. Solon merely said that out of politeness. But to Ryan, it didn't sound like that. This time, Ryan really wanted to swear. Do you fucking have to speak bullshit? I got slapped twice, how could this possibly appear elegant? Great Mage Ryan, I didn't mean that. As soon as the words left his mouth, Solon had also realized that he had misspoken. He wanted to quickly remedy it, but he didn't know how he should do it. Never mind. After Ryan took a deep breath, using the opportunity created by Solon's appearance, Ryan regained his bearing. As he calmed down, the bewilderment and confusion on his face slowly disappeared. Everything had happened too suddenly, he had been completely caught off guard by the circumstances. A mage had broken his Bloodvines spell and then slapped him twice, leaving him in a stupor. But Ryan was a genius who had broken through and become a great mage before he was even 30, after all. After finally calming down, it wasn't hard to figure out that this fellow simply knew the weak point of Bloodvines and that he wasn't actually powerful enough to bridge the immense gap between mages and great mages. With this understanding, Ryan's mood finally calmed down. As long as this was the case, he would get back at him for everything that had happened today sooner or later. But he definitely couldn't act today, because of Solon's appearance. Solon himself was a great mage, and he was also High Mage Solomon's precious disciple. His arrival itself represented the Sage Tower's attitude. Ryan, who had just calmed down, was greatly agitated by this new discovery. Why would the Sage Tower suddenly display such goodwill for a young mage of a declining family? What did that mean? No good. I have to return and consult with father about this. Mage Merlin, I hope you'll have such good luck again next time. With these words, Ryan turned around and left, not even greeting Solon. Upon hearing Ryan's parting words, Solon had stiffened in astonishment. It couldn't be right. His gaze drifted over to Lin Yun before stopping. The sentence was self-explanatory. If Solon only had an inkling before, he was now certain that Merlin was most likely the culprit behind the red imprints on the young great mage's face. Oh God! When he thought about this, Solon couldn't help holding his breath. That was a genuine great mage. Even if his hands and legs were tied, he would be easily able to kill a few novice mages just by opening his mouth. How could this be? How could he be slapped twice by someone like Mather Merlin? This is too irrational. How many secrets does this young mage have? I have to tell Teacher Solomon about this matter. Congratulations, Mage Merlin. I hope that your business is ever thriving. This is a small congratulatory gift. I hope you like it. See you later. After quickly blurting out these words, Solon didn't even wait for an answer as he thrust the 2 scrolls into Lin Yun's hands before running away. Chapter 20, Dragon Blood Ink. This chapter is updated by Novels.pl. After Solon left, Lin Yun did not return to his room. Instead, he washed his face with cold water and then picked up the 2 scrolls before heading to the place where he had overworked himself for a whole night. The alchemy laboratory. Solon's arrival wasn't strange at all. The value of the Spectrum potion was something that even a new mage like Raymond knew, let alone a sage tower that held 3 high mages. What truly baffled Lin Yun was the 2 scrolls that Solon had brought. A few alchemy formulas were written on the 2 scrolls, and they were relatively uncommon. They would be worth several thousand gold on the market. This was definitely a very good congratulatory gift. But to Lin Yun, these few alchemy formulas weren't important. The key part was the 2 scrolls themselves. When he first accepted the 2 scrolls, Lin Yun actually didn't take them seriously and was only being polite. His mind was filled with too many perfected formulas from the end of the magic era. So how could he still care about other alchemy formulas of this period? But after taking a few glances at them, Lin Yun suddenly found out that the letters on the scrolls seemed a bit too bright. After taking a careful look, he realized that these 2 scrolls had actually been written with dragon blood ink. This is just too shameful. Lin Yun lamented. Too extravagant, too wasteful. The best use for dragon blood ink was for alchemy arrays because the blood of dragons had astonishing amounts of mana within. Not only was this mana very easy to control, but it could even be brought to its full potential with only a few runes. If an alchemy array used dragon blood ink, then the mana source used to power it could be reduced by a few grades because the power of the dragon blood could support most of the array's operations. The mana source would only take an auxiliary role, but here, that dragon blood ink had been used to write a few mere alchemy formulas. Do you need to use precious dragon blood to write an alchemy formula? I wonder which bastard wasted so much. Lin Yun kept swearing while carrying the 2 scrolls toward the alchemy laboratory. He was unaware that in the distant cloud tower, an old mage sneezed. Afterwards, Lin Yun started getting busy. The always stingy and economical Lin Yun was surprisingly extravagant this time. All kinds of magic items came out, and many bottles of reagents were set up. Lin Yun spent a whole 10 hours, working from the afternoon into the night, not taking any breaks. This was how important the dragon blood ink was to Lin Yun. Mather Merlin's body was far inferior to that of the average mage, after all. If not for Lin Yun's arrival, with Mather's talents, he might have never become a mage in his lifetime. These kinds of inherent bodily flaws were unsolvable in this era. The only one that could fix it right now was the one coming from the end times, Lin Yun. But the methods were very troublesome, including special meditation or customized potions. Because the meditation would take too much time, Lin Yun unhesitantly chose the latter option. The name of this potion was Mana Baptism. At the peak of Nocent's magic civilization, nearly every newborn kid would receive a mana baptism. This mana baptism would not only enable them to gather their first bits of mana, but it would also greatly increase their constitution. Thus, in that era, nearly everyone would be gifted. Everyone would stand at the same starting line and there was no longer any requirement of a minimum amount of innate talent. What would decide their future would be their efforts and their luck. Afterwards, along with Nocent's mana exhaustion, fewer newborns were able to enjoy a mana baptism. After the most powerful mages were buried in the sand, no more of those precious potions appeared in Nocent, because there were no longer any mages that were able to slay a dragon. Dragon blood was the most important component of mana baptism. Without dragon blood, mana baptism would only become a common potion and wouldn't be able to bring forth the mana gathering effect, let alone further increasing one's constitution. Even though he had returned to this era that was so rich in resources, Lin Yun still couldn't avoid the headache of having to obtain some dragon blood. It was truly too uncommon, let alone a fledgling mage. Even some high mages might not be able to see a drop of dragon blood during their lifetime. They were in existence far above high mages. Extremely tyrannical physical power combined with magical abilities inherited through their bloodlines let the dragons stand proudly at the top of Nocent's food chain. From ancient times till the current day, there had been no more than 3 people that could slay a dragon. Each of them could be considered genuine legendary figures. When Lin Yun had included this in the list of things for Raymond to get, it was with a just-in-case attitude. He wasn't actually expecting to hear any news of it on that side. He had been prepared to struggle for a long time to obtain some. If it came to it, he would first operate the flashing gold chamber of commerce and build it up, before relying on financial resources. If 100,000 gold wasn't enough, then he would use 1,000,000. He would even use all of his family fortune to get a drop of dragon blood. At that time, Lin Yun couldn't have thought that someone would just drop by and gift him a drop of dragon blood. Naturally, it was too early to say that this was actually a drop of dragon blood. It was at best a few alchemy formulas written with dragon blood ink. But it was already enough for Lin Yun. These formulas were written with dragon blood ink, which obviously contained dragon blood. What Lin Yun needed to do now was to reconstitute the dragon blood ink from the alchemy formulas and then extract the true dragon blood from the dragon blood ink. It sounded very simple on paper, but carrying it out was an extremely complicated process. First of all, there were no fewer than 37 formulas for making dragon blood ink. Even if Lin Yun already knew all the current 37 formulas, he couldn't find out in a short time which one had been used for the ink on the 2 scrolls. The only way was to do some testing. This was a large project. The importance of dragon blood ink lays in using the power of the dragon blood to amplify the might of the arrays, to the point that it could even replace the mana source. To some extent, each drop of dragon blood ink was like a miniature alchemy formula. Thus, the formula of dragon blood ink was famous for being complicated. During those 10 hours, Lin Yun compounded almost 100 bottles of all kinds of reagents. He then used those reagents to various types of testing, all the way until it was the afternoon of the next day. After a whole 24 hours had passed, he had only eliminated 2 of the 37 formulas for sure. By that point, Lin Yun was no longer able to keep going. Analyzing the dragon blood ink's formulas wasn't something that could be completely solved with just the reagents. It relied more on the alchemist himself, while the reagents were only the materials. Analyzing the formulas would consume a great amount of energy and mana. Ordinarily, it would take a group of a few alchemists, sometimes even a dozen, working together to carry out something on the level of the dragon blood ink analysis that Lin Yun was doing. If word of his feat spread out, it might frighten many people. After eliminating 2 of the formulas, Lin Yun decided not to continue. Otherwise, he might collapse before managing to extract the drop of dragon blood. He washed his face with cold water and then told the old butler that unless he gave his authorization, no one was allowed to enter the Gilded Rose's alchemy laboratory. After doing that, Lin Yun returned to his room to sleep for 20 hours straight. For some time, Lin Yun stayed in the alchemy laboratory day and night, analyzing the formulas, eventually eliminating 20 kinds. If nothing unexpected happened, Lin Yun would be able to completely determine what formula was used in at most half a month. And at the same time, the business of the Gilded Rose also gradually improved. It was the richest district of Thousand Sails City, after all, and the golden signboard of the flashing gold chamber of commerce was very good for drawing attention. Even if a fool was in charge of the place, the business wouldn't be too bad. And Lin Yun was no fool. The potions crafted by Lin Yun had already run out of stock a week ago, and the magic armors and magic weapons had been bought up at very high prices in the first 2 days. Now, most of the items arranged on the shelves of the Gilded Rose were various kinds of alchemy products that the old butler had people import from outside. The price wasn't nearly as high, but they were practical. From this, it could be seen that the alchemy business was indeed a business that required daily work. Besides all the things that Lin Yun had personally crafted on the first day, the rest was stuff that the Gilded Rose acquired wholesale at a low price and was selling with some markup. They could easily make a profit of over 10,000 gold in under a month. The old butler was even thinking about hiring some alchemists at a high price once the business was back on track the next month. At that time, he would contact the old mercenary groups to get a steady supply of magic materials. His goal of restoring the Gilded Rose to its former splendor was almost in reach. Half a month soon passed. After Lin Yun finally found out which formulae had been used, he didn't immediately leave the alchemy laboratory. He busied himself inside for 2 more days before pushing the door open to leave. Feeling completely exhausted,